So we have not had a constant 9 justices. Mitch McConnell saw to it we had 8 justices.
Would the gentleman yield?
No.
It was a vacancy. It was still 9 justices.
I reclaim my time, and I will again say this is not the proper forum to debate this subject. It's not before us in this bill.
We're the Judiciary Committee, Mr. Chairman. I'm the
before-
ranking member of the Constitution Subcommittee. This is the perfect time. It's the essential time to discuss it because it came up tonight.
The time is my time. I haven't yielded. Haven't yielded it.
Mr. Chairman,
Who seeks recognition?
right here.
For what purpose does the gentleman seek recognition?
This is entirely appropriate amendment. As the
Mr.
gentleman,
Chairman, I move to table the amendment.
as the gentleman, I think I was recognized.
No.
Withdraw
The
my
gentleman
motion.
has the time. The gentleman has the time.
As the gentleman said with his amendment, page 14 of the bill, line 19, the commission, the 15-member commission made up of 15 Democrats. The 15 Democrats on the commission may enter into contracts with government entities, private entities, or persons for goods or services. And all the gentleman's amendment says is if there's a dispute about this contract that the 15 Democrats on this commission enter into, and it goes all the way to the Supreme Court, we don't want 13 people, we don't want 12 people, we don't want 11 people, we don't want 10 people, we want 9, or if someone has to it has to recuse themselves or whatever, we want them to decide the case. That's all the amendment says. So, again, as the gentleman from Louisiana pointed out, if the Democrats aren't going to push this legislation tomorrow, if they're not really going to do it, they can tell us that, but it sure looks like they are. Imagine if Republicans, you guys are going to take the court from 9 to 13, want to take the court from 9 to 13. Imagine if we went the other direction. We took it from 9 to 5. We got rid of 4 people. We just kept the Republicans that were put on recently to the court. Oh my goodness, you all go crazy. Let's just stick with the number that's been there for, 159 years, I think the gentleman said? This is just radical departure from what the norms of this country and what, as my colleague pointed out, every judicial scholar, left, right, center, has said makes sense. But you guys are going to do it. You guys are going to do it. And it is scary and it is wrong, and the country understands that. I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. Who else seeks recognition on this amendment?
Mr. Chairman?
Mr. Raskin. For what purpose does Mr. Raskin seek recognition?
I move to strike the last word.
Gentleman is recognized.
I just want to make a couple of points about what we're witnessing right now. It's obviously an irrelevant distraction from the matter at hand, the history of white supremacy, slavery, oppression of millions of African Americans in our country, the system of Jim Crow, racism, housing discrimination, official governmental discrimination in everything from employment policy to housing policy to transportation policy all across the country. And, Sheila Jackson Lee has presented a very important piece of legislation that bears serious consideration and analysis by every member of Congress and by all Americans. And I think that there's something trivializing about what's just happened, but let's go ahead and discuss it. To begin with, we come out of a period of extreme court packing by Mitch McConnell and Donald Trump. Mr. Cohen raised the question of the sandbagging and the derailment of Merrick Garland's nomination to the U.S. Supreme Court. Merrick Garland is the Chief Judge of the D.C. Circuit, one of the most distinguished jurists in the country. They refused even to give him a hearing for an entire year on the totally phony rationale that we don't have hearings for Supreme Court justices in the final year of a president's term, a completely new test they made up for Barack Obama. And then when there was a vacancy just 2 months before Donald Trump was to leave office, they stampeded through the Senate, overthrowing their own rule, the nomination of Amy Coney Barrett. That is court packing, as well as everything they've been doing to put a series of essentially unqualified right-wing bloggers on the federal circuit courts across the land by repealing the filibuster for appointments to the court. That was what Mitch McConnell did. They wanted to get rid of the filibuster so they could pack the courts, and they proceeded to do it. And of course, they're going to be whining about the filibuster, just like they're whining about proposals to study what to do about the system of right-wing judicial activism that they've imposed on the country over the last several years. But the gentleman has raised properly the question of the Supreme Court's involvement in racism and white supremacy. And of course, the Supreme Court referred to the Dred Scott decision, which was a white man's compact, and that there were no rights that African Americans have that the white man is bound to respect. And then even after the Civil War and the passage of the Reconstruction Amendments, the Supreme Court in Plessy versus Ferguson upheld the regime of separate but equal. And Jim Crow, and that lasted all the primary case and Brown's Board of Education in 1954, and for about 2 decades, the Supreme Court actually recognized African Americans until we get a complete racial backlash, and then we get into a period like we're in now with the Roberts Court, the Rehnquist Court. We get Bush versus Gore. We get Shaw versus Reno, Miller versus Johnson. We get Shelby County versus Holder, cutting the heart out of the Voting Rights Act. So yes, the Supreme Court is part of the engine of white supremacy in the country, and we can't think of it as something separate. I don't know what my position is on any hypothetical bill that is being bandied about tonight to distract everybody, but I think it's fine to make the Supreme Court part of the conversation, because the Supreme Court, for the vast majority of our history, has not been part of the solution to the problem of slavery and racism. The Supreme Court has been part of the problem. I yield back to you, Mr. Chairman.
The gentleman yields back.
Mr. Chairman.
For what purpose does Mr. Shabbat seek recognition?
Move to strike the last word.
Gentleman's recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Packing the Supreme Court, this is a blatant exercise of raw political power. And I guess since we're here tonight and it's come up tonight, Mr. Chairman, I again would like to just ask you, is this actually your intention to introduce this legislation? And I'll yield to you. Mr. Chairman, I yield to you.
We'll have an announcement tomorrow.
Okay, well, tomorrow is in about an hour and 40 minutes, so it'll be around midnight?
I didn't mean that quite that literally.
All right. Well, we'll bated breath. But, and I want to commend the gentleman from Louisiana for offering this amendment, because the amendment goes back to the bill that we're talking about here, when the bill relative to reparations calls for a study. You know, we're just going to study it. We're going to study slavery, its effects, and what are we going to do about it? And then the answer, of course, we know that's going to come out of that commission is something that's been talked about for some time now, and that's reparations, which, as I mentioned before, is basically taking money from people who never owned slaves and give it to people who never were slaves. Slavery ended again 150 years ago, so that's what's happening here. And packing the Supreme Court, as you apparently want to do, we'll find out tomorrow for sure, although again, the president already announced a commission that was loaded with a bunch of folks from left-wing organizations and universities and academics, and I think we know exactly where they're going to go, but packing the Supreme Court, as you want to do, would totally politicize the court. And politicizing the court to such a degree would destroy public trust in the one institution that still has the public's trust. They certainly don't trust our branch of the government, unfortunately. I think if we work together in a bipartisan manner, we could actually earn their trust once again, and that's what we ought to be doing, which both of the this legislation is a furthest thing from something that's bipartisan or that has both sides' input in it. But we shouldn't do that to the Supreme Court. Public trust in that institution, to damage that is, I think, packing that court would do, would probably be irreparable. That's why it hasn't happened for a century and a half. And you talk about it going up and down, which sure as heck hasn't gone up or down for a long, long time. And I guess one consolation is I think the president has to know that if you actually move ahead with this, it's going to hurt both him and you politically, tremendously, just as it did FDR when he attempted and failed to do this. So maybe the president will figure that he can, and I think this may be what's happening here, that he can placate his radical left supporters by calling this commission together, maybe ultimately not moving forward with it. But the Democratic makeup of both the House and the Senate is so left-wing, so radical now, that you just may move ahead with this thing. And then God help the country. And I'd now like to yield to the ranking member, Mr.
I thank the gentleman for, I bet at tomorrow's press conference, the Democrats are going to tell us that packing the court is really infrastructure. How much you want to bet? I mean, in the professor from Maryland, his revisionist history, it wasn't the Republicans in the Senate who changed the filibuster, it was Senator Reid. He changed it. You guys just redefine things, make things up. I mean, this is, and the professor from Maryland said that, that it's an irrelevant distraction. Adding 4 new justices to the Supreme Court, changing 159 years of American history, is a distraction? This is looniness. I mean, I've never seen anything like it. Packing the Supreme... You guys just redefine terms. Infrastructure now means everything. Packing the court used to mean you added justices to the court, which they're going to attempt to do in a press conference that they unveil their bill tomorrow. They now accuse us of packing the court when we just tried to fill the 9 spot, the open seats. You could, I mean, this, the gentleman is right. Where they're headed is scary. It should frighten every single American. I hope you stop. I hope you don't do it. But the chairman of the House Judiciary Committee leading a bill, sponsoring a bill to pack the United States Supreme Court, add 4 new justices, it's never happened in American history. I yield back to the gentleman.
His time has expired. For what purpose does the gentlelady from Florida from Texas seek recognition?
I love Florida, Mr. Chairman, but I am from Texas, and I thank
Second
you
time
so
we've
very
done that
much.
today, I know.
I mentioned my father in a previous, I rise to strike the last word, in a previous statement. And I'd said earlier that this is not about any one of us, but I do believe it's about facts. And as I continue to hear the debate of my good friends, and they are my good friends on the other side of the aisle, I couldn't help but bring a finite and small story of my own that realistically tells the truth. What happened to black men and black women? What happened to those families that lived in those closed communities and raised their children with the aspirations that education would bring them a brighter day? Well, I can tell you, my friends, what happened. For that reason, I don't take issue with anyone's integrity, but it hurts my heart that a distraction like this amendment would again tell black people in America, you don't matter. We don't care. We don't care about your pain. We don't care about the 4 million who were held in slavery. We don't care about the wealth that this country was built on cotton when cotton was king. We don't care. We don't care that those enclaves of black communities with restaurants and beauty shops and others were ultimately destroyed by highways, the inability to access loans or banking or capital. We don't care about the idea that you didn't have enough money to send Johnny to college. We don't care that sometimes your only route out is athletics. But then again, how many we leave behind? We don't care. We're going to take this opportunity to put up a straw man about packing the courts when Donald Trump put 200 plus unqualified, mostly persons on this court, the district court. It was evidenced not by me, but it was evidenced by a number of accounts of individuals who came to the court. You don't care. And I just can't sit here and allow you not to care. So here's what this bill is about. H.R. 40 is a commission to study and develop reparation proposals. It deals with the government's affirmation and sanction of slavery and discrimination. No one alive today was enslaved by, but there are millions of Americans who were born and lived under a regimen of legal racial discrimination. That's Black people. Its historical origins rooted in slavery and whose harms weren't limited to individuals, but entire communities and the generations that followed. It also ignores the fact that for decades after slavery officially ended, the federal government, of which we are all members and which still exists today, at best ignored and at worst actively enabled this state-enforced racial discrimination. Reconstruction after the Civil War imploded took nearly 100 years to be able to get the second Reconstruction in the Civil Rights Movement. But let me tell you about the Civil Rights Movement. Has anybody heard of the individuals during that short era that were killed? Johnny Lee Jackson, all he wanted to do was vote. The four little girls in Birmingham, all they wanted to do is go to Sunday school, and they were bombed to death. Never to grow up to be what their parents knew they could be. Anybody understands the numbers of Black folk that walked down country roads and never were found again because they were hung, buried deep in the dirt, never to be found? Does everybody know the dreams of so many young men of the 1940s and 50s who did have aspirations? Or the young people going to broken schools who did have aspirations, but were living under forced racial segregation and discrimination? Or that young person with their bright new suit on going to get a new job and ultimately rejected because of the color of their skin? How many can we account for that? College degree, or young men who worked in the post office because they could not get a job. Oh, we're not whining. We're not crying. We're patriotic. We'll stand against anyone in this country to ask us about our patriotism. We fought in every war since the Revolutionary War. Every war. We are law enforcement officers. We're firefighters. We're teachers. We're patriots. We teach our children to say, I pledge allegiance to this flag. But yet we live under forced segregation and racism. And this particular commission is to open the eyes of all of us. We don't know what the truth will be. It may be your truth. Blame us. I have faith in a commission established by this Congress to find out the truth, as commissions have done. And I have faith in the values of this nation, that we will uphold truth when we see it, and that we will come around to recognizing that reparations is not a handout. It is restoration, it is reconciliation, it is healing. It is American. We need to pass this legislation, and we need to pass it now. H.R. 40 will bring us together, not with anguish,
Was
but
only
through truth.
yield for a question?
My time has expired. I ask my colleagues to support the H.R. 40 Commission to study and develop reparation proposals. I thank the gentleman for yielding to me.
For what purpose, the gentlelady is yielded. For what purpose does the gentleman from California, Mr. Issa, seek recognition?
To strike the last word, Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman is recognized.
I'd yield to the ranking member.
Well, I mean, I've heard the gentlelady from Texas, and I appreciate my good friend and colleague many times today talk about healing and coming together. But the commission, I mean, if you really wanted to work together with the other side, the commission is President Biden selects 3 members, Senator Leahy selects 3 members, Speaker Pelosi selects 3 members. Why didn't you have Leader McCarthy select some members? I mean, there might be some Republicans who want to serve on this commission. Why is it so partisan, but at the same time you're telling us you want to work with us and come together, but you got 9 Democrats, and then the other 6 come from organizations that already said they support reparations. So you can tell us you want to work with us, but you sure didn't act like it when you put the legislation together. I yield to the gentleman from California.
Well,
Thank
do
you.
you gentlemen want me to answer or not? I'd be happy to answer the question.
Thank you. I reclaim my time, and I'll get to the gentlelady in just a second. But Our founding fathers wrote that we, the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect union, establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility, provide for the common defense, and promote the general welfare, and ensure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity, do ordain and establish this Constitution of the United States of America. Those words in the preamble should be our guiding principle on anything we do that resembles what people are saying this commission would do. And as the ranking member said so eloquently, what part of this commission is going to create that feeling of domestic tranquility? What part of this commission is done in a way in which the American people can believe that it doesn't know what it will find, but it will seek the truth? And so it's sad on a night in which we discover that the chairman and the speaker intend to pack the court. We find out, while we're discussing something here, that there's nothing wrong with studying the history of slavery, and there's certainly nothing wrong with those decades of seeking a more perfect union in which time and time again we have failed. Now, before I yield to the gentlelady from Texas, who I've traveled with, who we've been together for many, many years in many places, she brought up some very good points of recent discrimination and some points of continued discrimination. This committee has, over its life, been dedicated time and time again to looking at current discrimination, current unfairness, and correcting it. And I would hope that at some point we return to just that, because the gentlelady clearly has ideas of things which still need to be changed in order to live up to our ancestors, at least politically, who asked us to form a more perfect union and to ensure domestic tranquility and to seek justice for all. And I would yield to my good friend from Texas.
I thank the gentleman, and first let me say to the ranking member of the full committee, my time had expired. I know that I'd always welcome the opportunity to yield to Mr. Jordan, so thank you for understanding that. To the gentleman from California, we have traveled together, and I'll get to the point, and let me just respond to Mr. Jordan. First of all, I welcome any of my friends that would love to be a co-sponsor of this legislation. We're not finished. We're going to continue to do so, but as the legislation is now written, it is in consultation with this committee, and we have every opportunity to be able to engage Republicans or engage Republicans through the minority leader. So we're open to truth. We want everybody to be able to accept the truth. And with that, I would say to my good friend from California, the idea of a more perfect union is emotionally unique to all of us, meaning it means something to us. And yes, this committee has looked over the decades, over its history of injustices, and I'm proud to say in our tenure, we've done things together. But walk a mile in the shoes of the descendants of those enslaved Africans, but more importantly, walk a mile in the shoes of those who are still feeling the vestiges and legacy of both racism and segregation. And my friend, it has come through various governmental actions. So I don't want to predict. That's why I always say it's not about a check. It's about the study and the development of systemic response that you can be a part of. Because the only way we will heal and repair and restore is if we work together on this. The one thing this room cannot deny tonight is that African Americans today, April 14, 2021, are not experiencing racism in America today. You can't deny it. So let's get this commission that is congressionally run, comes out of the Congress, that we will have the opportunity to get the report back to us. With that, I yield back to the gentleman.
And I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. For what purpose does Mr. Swalwell seek recognition?
I move to strike the last word.
Gentleman is recognized.
Mr. Chairman, a CNN story struck me just a couple days ago as we were preparing for this hearing. It said that a century ago, a black couple owned a beach resort in Manhattan Beach, a Southern California town probably in Mr. Liu or Miss Bass's district, known for its scenic expanse, and inviting soulful energy, and the songs of Black entertainers radiated throughout the corridors of the dance hall and lodge. But the music and good times would not last due to the strict racial segregation that dominated American life then.
That's right.
Harassment from white neighbors and the Ku Klux Klan tore away at the dreams of owners, Charles and Willa Bruce. The final blow came in 1924, when the city took the property through eminent domain and paid the couple a fraction of what they asked for. The city wanted the land for a park. The Bruces left and died 5 years later, leaving many heirs, many who are still alive today. Now, there's a move afoot to provide justice to their descendants. Los Angeles County officials on Friday said they are working with state lawmakers on legislation that would return the property, which is worth $75 million. That's one family in America that suffered through discrimination in this country. I support Ms. Jackson Lee's legislation to have a commission to look at how you make families right. Not every family like the Bruces will have a LA County supervisor advocating on their behalf, who happens to be former member of Congress, Janice Hahn, who's leading the effort there. Not every family will have someone fighting to make sure that they are made whole. This commission looks at how we can best do that. That's why I support it. Now, I see these efforts to talk about the Supreme Court and the democratic roles back in the 19th century as just a way to ignore the responsibility we all have to Black Americans, to make sure that they are made whole. I understand why it may be uncomfortable if you have supported for the last 5 years a person who said that many people coming to our country from the continent of Africa are coming from S-hole countries, the same countries that many slaves against their will were brought to America. I understand why that may make you uncomfortable. I understand that if you voted to keep Confederate monuments in the Capitol, this may be an uncomfortable conversation and you would rather talk about the Supreme Court. So it really comes down to this. If you think racism, slavery was not a problem in our country, you should vote against Ms. Jackson Lee's legislation. If you think Jim Crow did not exist and didn't affect people still today as it was passed down and their families and the discrimination and the hardships they've suffered, you should vote against this. If you think white supremacy does not exist and does not affect Black Americans, you should vote against this. But if you think we should do something to better understand inequality in America, the original sin, and what we can all do to make sure that we make this right, you should vote for this legislation. That's why I'm going to do that, and I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. For what purpose does the gentleman from Arizona seek recognition?
Move to strike the last word.
Gentleman's recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I don't think anyone's felt uncomfortable. We've had a very lively and lengthy discussion about an important issue that's important to our nation. And I appreciate the various opinions and discussion that's taken place. But this particular amendment offered by the gentleman from Louisiana is not a distraction. It's not de minimis. Kind of gets at the heart of what's happening here tonight. We're talking about if there's a conflict to arise based on a contract that is issued pursuant to a commission were one to be formed, that we have a 9-person Supreme Court adjudicate that issue. Now, we're told that that's a distraction, that that's an attempt to hide the ball from the gentlelady's bill. Nothing can be further from the truth. If this is not true, the chairman here could absolutely change it. But this is the way rumors get started. So you had The Intercept put something out. That's picked up by the Daily Wire. That's picked up by other news services. And this is what they say, that the House and Senate Democrats are going to unveil the the legislation to pack the Supreme Court with 4 new justices. And packing a Supreme Court is that. You're adding Supreme Court justices so you can get an unfair advantage that you don't have now. It isn't by filling vacancies. You can't change the term. This bill would add 4 seats to the High Court, bringing the total to 13 from the current 9. And it's quoting from the first article, it says the bill is led by House Judiciary Committee Chair Jerry Nadler, Subcommittee Chair Hank Johnson, Freshman Rep. Mondaire Jones, and in the Senate being championed by Ed Markey of Massachusetts. Well, then it goes on to cite why it's a bad idea. Who has said it's a bad idea? None other than Senator Bernie Sanders. He said if Democrats do it, then the next time the Republicans will do it. Supreme Court Justice Stephen Breyer, registered Democrat, told Harvard just last week, confidence in the courts and in the rule of law itself will lead to diminishing the court's power, including its power to act as a check on the other branches. Supreme Court Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg warned against packing the court, saying it will make the court appear more partisan and will trigger a constant expansion of the courts every time there's a power change in Washington, D.C. And even former Democrat Senator Harry Reid, who, by the way, and I thank the ranking member for clarifying this, he is the one that changed the filibuster rules so he could attempt to fill the judiciary at the federal level with leftist liberal judges. Anyway, Harry Reid warned over the weekend that Democrats better be careful with trying to alter the composition of the Supreme Court. Harry Reid said, I think we should be very, very careful in doing so. I have no problem with the commission, but I think that the commission is going to come back and disappoint a lot of people because they're going to come back and say, we should just kind of leave it alone. It would be inappropriate at this time, after that long history we've had in this country, to have term limits for judges and change and expand the Supreme Court. And the last one was from Article 3 Project, warned that the move was alarming. It must be met with the harshest of denunciations from both sides of the aisle. So here we stand. We've been having a very lively debate about something that's very important to a lot of people, and in fact, the entire nation. And we're not the ones that offered a distraction. We've been having this discussion, fact-based, and it's gone back and forth. And that's a healthy type of thing for a deliberative body. It wasn't us that brought into the fray this notion of packing the United States Supreme Court. Packing the United States Supreme Court is one of the worst things that could happen at this time. And I'll yield now to the ranking member, Mr. Jordan.
Yeah, I think jump for you. I just pointed out, I was joking when I said earlier that Democrats will probably say packing the court's infrastructure. In fact, the chairman laughed. We all laughed. But it's true. One of the co-sponsors of the legislation, the gentleman just pointed out, Mr. Jones, one of our colleagues, tweeted out an hour ago, Supreme Court expansion is infrastructure. You can't make this stuff up. One of our colleagues on the Judiciary Committee actually said that, tweeted that out an hour ago. I had no idea, but our staff just showed it to me. This is how crazy it has become. And they call it a distraction. I yield back to the gentleman.
Thank you. My time's expired. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
For what purpose does Mr. Roy seek recognition?
Move to strike, last word.
Gentleman's recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I don't believe that this conversation is a distraction because everything we're talking about here is about power. That's what this is all about. Everything we're talking about here is about power. Who gets to decide? That's the question. Who gets to decide? And this is all about the future of our nation right now. And when we think about these important decisions about when you pack the court and you add 4 justices, that changes very much the question of who decides on these important issues. And we know the important issues that have come before the court. Roe versus Wade, 62 million dead babies since Roe versus Wade. Marriage, the definition of marriage, whether someone can bake a cake and not be able to not be persecuted based on their religious beliefs. Gun rights, free speech rights, the ability not to have those trampled. All of these things are things that are decided by the court, and the whole purpose of packing it is to get a result. That's the purpose of packing it. is to get a result from the court. And we want to talk about results, we could talk right now about Brown and Plessy. What was right? I think Plessy was wrong, Brown was right, and I think that was the case because Charles Sumner and some of the history, if you look at it, would tell you that Plessy got the intent of the ratifiers wrong, and Brown corrected it. But go listen to Elena Kagan's testimony in 2008 when she danced around the questions from Senator Cornyn about that very question, basically implying that, well, Brown just made up for this and let the law catch up. That's what happens when the court makes the law. That's what happens when the court becomes activist. That's why these questions matter. It's outcome-based policymaking. We're trying to make the Supreme Court turn into something to create policy. Let's go back to something that the ranking member said.
Would the gentleman yield for question?
If you give 1 second, Chair, if I can go a little bit farther, then I'll try. Unless I can continue time, I have additional time. So what the ranking member brought up was in the issue that was raised about the court. Okay, let's go back to 2003 for a second. Miguel Estrada, does anybody remember that name? Priscilla Owens, does anybody remember that name? Janice Rogers Brown, anybody remember those names? Miguel Estrada was denied the ability to be on the DC Court of Appeals. Why? Because he's Hispanic. Straight up true. We know it. Why? Democratic memos. We can't talk about it because those memos came off of a server that a staffer found and everybody said, hush, hush, let's slide that under the rug. But Miguel Estrada was purposely denied the ability to serve in the DC Court of Appeals because he is Hispanic and he's conservative. That's a fact. We know it's a fact. Oh no, but sweep that aside. Priscilla Owen, Janice Rogers Brown, African-American woman from California, also denied. Bill Frist thought about blowing up the filibuster, chose not to. Who blew up the filibuster?
Harry Reid.
Democrat Harry Reid blew up the filibuster. And here we sit. I yield to the ranking member.
The gentleman is exactly right. I think gentleman for yielding. This is about power. Why 4 seats? Why not 1? Why not add 2? Why not 3? Why not 5? Why 4? Why the number 4? Because that gives them a 7-6 majority. It is totally about power. Why go to 13? Because you want the 4 liberals on the court to deal with the very issues the gentleman brought up, the life issue and everything else. It is totally about raw political power. And it's disgusting to watch. I yield back to the gentleman.
Well, I thank the ranking member. What I'll tell you is, you go back to 1937. What did Chief Justice Charles Evan Hughes say to FDR? Quote, there would be more judges to hear, more judges to confer, more judges to discuss, more judges to be convinced and decide. It would blow up the court. That number 9, all 50 states have 7 to 9 Supreme Court justices. They don't have 13.
Would the gentleman yield?
They don't have 17. Who just asked that question?
Jackson Lee.
I would yield to the gentleman from Texas.
The recounting, your time is gone, but let me just quickly say the recounting of history is important for this committee.
Yes, ma'am.
And I welcome it. I would just simply say this. I would look factually, maybe that could be something under the commission to really determine whether anyone was rejected because of their race or might have been because of their philosophy. But I also asked the question about any of the judges that have been appointed in the last 4 years. They have a record of concern about equal justice under the law. That maybe has been the issue on judges not being confirmed. But maybe our commission will also look at the question of the courts, since it is comprehensively looking at the issue of race discrimination in this country. And that may bring us some more facts. I thank the gentleman from yielding, and I don't know anything about court packing or legislation regarding courts. There's nothing that I see that has been announced or introduced. But let me go on record and say that if such legislation is, I will co-sponsor it. I yield back.
The gentlelady yields back. The time of the gentleman has
I'd
expired.
reclaim my time, but I don't have any reclaim.
Gentleman, the time has expired. For what purpose does Mr. Bishop seek recognition?
Strike the last word.
Gentleman is recognized.
So, the cat's out of the bag. Court packing plan, ready to roll. And when FDR buoyed by that massive electoral mandate and his majorities in 1936, proposed to pack the court in 1937. Despite the political power Democrats wielded, it was Democrats in Congress who stopped FDR's court-packing plan cold. It was those bad old racist Democrats whom today's Democrats judge from their lofty sanctimony, who had the self-discipline and statesmanship to tell FDR no when he assaulted the foundations of our constitutional system. What do today's Democrats, congressional Democrats, the new, morally superior, virtuous Democrats do on a bare 2-vote majority in this Congress? Plot in secret to bring forward a unilateral, completely partisan plan to pack the Supreme Court. They play ridiculous games with words, or I should better say ominous games. Child care is infrastructure. Court packing means filling a vacancy. The freest country in the world, the freest country the world has ever seen, is hopelessly and systemically racist. We've heard this technique before. War is peace. Freedom is slavery. Ignorance is strength. The new, virtuous Democrats disregard the warnings of Justices Ginsburg and Breyer, of 1983's Joe Biden, even Harry Reid, no slouch in hard-knuckle exercise of political power, that one. Even Harry Reid rejected court packing. And by that I mean court packing. These are the Democrats who can define and dispense justice through a commission of all Democrats. They will pursue power at any price. They profess constantly the goal of unity while driving and embracing every means conceivable of dividing Americans against one another. They're working to, quote, end policing. They're transforming the concept of voting. They want to completely remake America as we know it and bring us all together. I yield back.
Well done.
Gentleman yields back. For what purpose does the gentleman from Oregon seek recognition?
Move to strike the last word, Mr. Chair.
Gentleman is recognized.
I yield to Mr. Johnson from Louisiana.
I really thank the gentleman for yielding. I have to first respond to my good friend, Ms. Jackson Lee. She suggested that our urgent concern tonight about this breaking news that there's a plan afoot to radically transform the U.S. Supreme Court is somehow a signal that we don't agree that slavery was an unspeakable national sin and that racial discrimination is a wretched evil. So let me be crystal clear. All of us agree that racism violates the most fundamental principles of our great nation and the rules of our Creator to boot. The central idea of America is that we boldly declare the self-evident truth that all men are created equal, and they are thus endowed with the same inalienable rights. Our founders said that because they believed and understood that all men are created in the image of God. And because of that, every single person has inestimable dignity and value, and your value is not related in any way to the color of your skin or what neighborhood you live in, what you made on the ACT, what you look like, what your talents are, none of that. All that's irrelevant. Your value is inherent because it is given to you by God. So it follows then that any fool who contends that he has some sort of natural right of supremacy over his neighbors violates not only the foundational creed of America, but also the greatest commandments of the God who created him. Because we're told in Scripture that we love the Lord our God first and then love our neighbor as ourselves. So that aside, I just wanted to bring us back to the point, this urgent point, this thing that we're all so deeply concerned about, that we might just radically transform one of the fundamental institutions that is holding this great republic together, the one that was founded by those foundational truths in the Declaration. Let me read and just close with two more excerpts from that Senate Judiciary Committee's adverse report to the New Deal legislation's judicial reorganization plan from 1937. Quote, "Shall we now, after 150 years of loyalty to the constitutional idea of an untrammeled judiciary, duty-bound to protect the constitutional rights of the humblest citizen, even against the government itself, create the vicious precedent which must necessarily undermine our system? The only argument for the increase, which survives analysis, is that Congress should enlarge the court so as to make the policies of the administration effective. But court packing would subjugate the courts to the will of Congress and the president, and thereby destroy the independence of the judiciary, the only certain shield of individual rights. Under the form of the Constitution, it seeks to do that which is unconstitutional. Its ultimate operation," they concluded, "would be to make this government one of men rather than one of law. And its practical operation would be to make the Constitution what the executive or legislative branches of the government choose to say it is, an interpretation to be changed with each change of administration. It is a measure which should be so emphatically rejected that its parallel will never again be presented to the free representatives of the free people of America," unquote. You know, that was written by the supermajority of Democrats who were in charge of both houses of Congress in 1937. That admonition echoes down through us to us today, and we ought to heed it because they were exactly right. I've never agreed with Democrats so much as that beautiful piece of prose, and you ought to read it yourself and be reminded that what you're about to do tomorrow, Mr. Chairman, and everybody who's an accomplice in this, is destroy one of the foundational precepts of this great country that we all love so much. We're in a process of becoming a greater nation, and this is all part of the growing pains, but I'm telling you, you can't change this. So I will...
Would the gentleman yield?
I'll yield to the gentleman from Texas. Go ahead.
I would just ask the gentleman if you believe is correct, if your recollection of history is like mine, that there are numerous cases where presidents have had their policies or their desires struck down by courts in which they've got justices in there that they themselves appointed. For example, the landmark case in which the court curbed presidential power by striking down presidential Harry Truman's steel seizure was decided by a majority that included 2 Truman appointees. President Obama had numerous times checked. President Nixon's presidency was signaled when the full Supreme Court, including his own appointees, rejected his claims of executive privilege. We also are aware, as we recall, what occurred in December in Texas v. Pennsylvania. Would the gentleman agree that that is often the case and that politicizing the court would lead to its downfall?
Absolutely, and that's part of our system. It's one of the perils of a free republic in our system of checks and balances in our 3 branches of government. But we ought to keep it because it served us pretty darn well for 245 years. I urge support of this amendment, and I yield back.
All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Opposed, no.
I have
No.
submission.
The noes have it. And the amendment is not approved. Are there any other amendments to the amendment in the nature of a substitute?
We want to vote on that one. I mean, we want to vote on that one. Yeah. We ask for a recorded
State
vote.
your point of order, Mr. Cicilline.
The vote is closed.
It's true.
Ask for a vote, roll call vote after the vote's concluded.
Ms.
Point of
Cicilline,
order is well what?
seriously?
Yeah.
Seriously.
Seriously?
Seriously.
Come on.
Mr. Cicilline, we'll, technically, I think Mr. Cicilline is right, but
Well, this is
but
all
we
political power.
we will give you the courtesy of a recorded vote. The clerk
Thank you,
will
Mr.
call the
Chairman.
roll.
God bless you.
Mr. Nadler.
No.
Mr. Nadler votes no. Ms. Lofgren.
No.
Ms. Lofgren votes no. Ms. Jackson Lee.
No.
Ms. Jackson Lee votes no. Mr. Cohen. Mr. Cohen votes no. Mr. Johnson of Georgia.
No.
Mr. Johnson of Georgia votes no. Mr. Deutsch.
No.
Mr. Deutsch votes no. Ms. Bass.
No.
Ms. Bass votes no. Mr. Jeffries. Mr. Cicilline. Mr. Cicilline votes no. Mr. Swalwell.
No.
Mr. Swalwell votes no. Mr. Liu. Mr. Raskin.
No.
Mr. Raskin votes no. Ms. Jayapal.
No.
Ms. Jayapal votes no. Ms. Demings.
No.
Ms. Demings votes no. Mr. Correa. Mr. Correa votes no. Ms. Scanlon.
No.
Ms. Scanlon votes no. Ms. Garcia.
No.
Ms. Garcia votes no. Mr. Neguse.
No.
Mr. Neguse votes no. Ms. McBath. Mr. Stanton.
Stanton votes no.
Mr. Stanton votes no. Ms. Dean.
Dean, no.
Ms. Dean votes no. Ms. Escobar.
No.
Ms. Escobar votes no. Mr. Jones.
No.
Mr. Jones votes no. Ms. Ross.
Ross votes no.
Ms. Ross votes no. Ms. Bush.
Ms. Bush votes no.
Ms. Bush votes no. Mr. Jordan. Mr. Jordan votes yes. Mr. Shabbat. Mr. Shabbat votes aye. Mr. Gomer. Mr. Issa.
Aye.
Mr. Issa votes aye. Mr. Buck. Mr. Buck votes aye. Mr. Gates.
Aye.
Mr. Gates votes aye. Mr. Johnson of Louisiana. Mr. Johnson of Louisiana votes aye. Mr. Biggs. Mr. Biggs votes aye. Mr. McClintock.
Aye.
Mr. McClintock votes aye. Mr. Stubbe.
Yes.
Mr. Stubbe votes yes. Mr. Tiffany. Mr. Massey. Yes. Mr. Massey votes yes. Mr. Roy. Aye. Mr. Roy votes aye. Mr. Bishop. Aye. Mr. Bishop votes aye. Ms. Fischbach.
Aye.
Ms. Fischbach votes aye. Ms. Spartz.
Yes.
Ms. Spartz votes yes. Mr. Fitzgerald. Mr. Fitzgerald votes aye. Mr. Benz. Mr. Benz votes yes. Mr. Owens. Mr. Owens votes yes.
How am I recorded?
Mr. Liu, you are not recorded.
Lou votes no.
Mr. Liu votes no. Mr. Jeffries, you are not recorded. Mr. Jeffries votes no.
Has everyone voted who wishes to vote? The clerk will report.
Mr. Chairman, there are 17 ayes and 24 noes.
The amendment is not agreed to. Are there any further amendments to the amendment in the nature of a substitute? Hearing none. The question occurs on the amendment in the nature of a substitute. This will be followed immediately by a vote on final passage of the bill. All those in favor respond by saying aye. Aye. Opposed, no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. The amendment in the nature of a substitute is agreed to. A reporting quorum. What purpose does Ms. Jackson-Lee seek recognition?
I'd like to offer two documents into the record. I'd like to offer into the record a letter from the U.S. Conference of Mayors dated April 13th, 2021. And I'd like to acknowledge the Why We Can't Wait letter that had more than 300 co-sponsors, asked unanimous consent.
Without objection.
I'd like to put into the record page 1 of the Constitution and pages, Amendment 13, 14, and 15, ask unanimous consent to place those statements in the Constitution in the record.
Without objection. Reporting quorum being present, the
Mr.
question
Chairman.
is on the motion to report the bill
Mr. Chairman.
H.R. 40 as amended favorably to the House.
Mr. Chairman,
For what purposes Mrs. Swalwell seek recognition?
thank you. I would also seek unanimous consent to offer into the record a Monday, April 12, 2021 CNN article, "A Black family's beach property in California was taken during the Jim Crow era. The county has now given it back and it's worth millions."
Without objection. For what purpose does Mr. Jeffrey seek recognition?
Ask unanimous consent to enter into the record a few articles, one on the Freedmen's Bank, one on what happened 99 years ago in the Tulsa Race Massacre, one on the next New Deal must be for Black Americans, two, one on how the GI Bill's promise was denied to 1 million Black World War II veterans, and one on the story behind 40 Acres and a Mule.
Without objection, a reporting quorum being present, the question is on the motion to report the bill H.R. 40 as amended favorably to the House. Those in favor respond by saying aye. Aye.
Aye.
Opposed, no. The ayes have it, and the bill is ordered reported favorably.
That's a recorded vote.
Recorded vote has been requested. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Nadler.
Aye.
Mr. Nadler votes aye. Ms. Lofgren.
Yes.
Ms. Lofgren votes yes. Ms. Jackson Lee.
Aye.
Ms. Jackson Lee votes aye. Mr. Cohen. Mr. Cohen votes aye. Mr. Johnson of Georgia.
Yay.
Mr. Johnson of Georgia votes yea. Mr. Deutsch.
Aye.
Mr. Deutsch votes aye. Ms. Bass.
Aye.
Ms. Bass votes aye. Mr. Jeffries. Mr. Jeffries votes aye. Mr. Cicilline. Mr. Cicilline votes aye. Mr. Swalwell.
Aye.
Mr. Swalwell votes aye. Mr. Liu.
Aye.
Mr. Liu votes aye. Mr. Raskin.
Aye.
Mr. Raskin votes aye. Ms. Jayapal.
Aye.
Ms. Jayapal votes aye. Ms. Demings.
Aye.
Ms. Demings votes aye. Mr. Correa. Mr. Correa votes aye. Ms. Scanlon.
Aye.
Ms. Scanlon votes aye. Ms. Garcia.
Aye.
Ms. Garcia votes aye. Mr. Neguse.
Aye.
Mr. Neguse votes aye. Ms. McBath.
Aye.
Ms. McBath votes aye. Mr. Stanton.
Aye.
Mr. Stanton votes aye. Ms. Dean.
Aye.
Ms. Dean votes aye. Ms. Escobar.
Aye.
Ms. Escobar votes aye. Mr. Jones.
Aye.
Mr. Jones votes aye. Ms. Ross.
Aye.
Ms. Ross votes aye. Ms. Bush.
Ms. Bush votes aye.
Ms. Bush votes aye. Mr. Jordan.
No.
Mr. Jordan votes no. Mr. Shabbat. Mr. Shabbat votes no. Mr. Gomer. Mr. Issa. Mr. Issa. Mr. Issa votes no. Mr. Buck. Mr. Buck votes no. Mr. Gates.
No.
Mr. Gates votes no. Mr. Johnson of Louisiana. Mr. Johnson of Louisiana votes no. Mr. Biggs. Mr. Biggs votes no. Mr. McClintock.
No.
Mr. McClintock votes no. Mr. Stubbe.
No.
Mr. Stubbe votes no. Mr. Tiffany. Mr. Massey. Mr. Massey votes no. Mr. Roy. Mr. Roy votes no. Mr. Bishop.
No.
Mr. Bishop votes no. Ms. Fischbach.
No.
Ms. Fischbach votes no. Ms. Spartz.
No.
Ms. Spartz votes no. Mr. Fitzgerald. Mr. Fitzgerald votes no. Mr. Benz. Mr. Benz votes no. Mr. Owens. Mr. Owens votes no.
Has everyone voted who wishes to vote? The clerk will report.
Mr. Chairman, there are 25 ayes and 17 noes.
The bill, the bill is approved. Members will have 2 days to submit views. Without objection, the bill will be reported as a single amendment in nature of a substitute incorporating all adopted amendments, and the staff is authorized to make technical and conforming changes. Pursuant to notice, I now call up the final report on investigation of competition in digital markets for consideration and move that the committee adopt the report and file it with the House. Pursuant to Clause 1B2 of House Rule 11, Because the text of this report has been available to members for at least 24 hours, it is considered read. In light of the hour, I am going to place my full statement in the record. I will just note that Mr. Cicilline and his colleagues on the Antitrust Subcommittee have produced an invaluable resource that will help inform our efforts to strengthen competition in digital markets and throughout the economy, and I urge all members to adopt the report. I now recognize the distinguished ranking member of the Judiciary Committee, the gentleman from Ohio, from Mr. Jordan, for his opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. We're going to have some amendments to the report. The report that we will, I think 3 that we will offer, but in our judgment, the report doesn't address the fundamental issue of big tech's attack on conservatives and some of the unprecedented things we saw happen last fall in the course of the presidential campaign. So we have some amendments that we'll offer, but hopefully we can move through this pretty quickly. We have some amendments that we'll offer. Hopefully we'll move through this pretty quickly, but I know Mr. Biggs has our first amendment.
The gentleman the gentleman yields back. For what purpose does Mr. Biggs seek recognition?
I have an amendment at the desk.
The clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment 2, final report on investigation of competition in digital markets offered by Biggs of Arizona. On page 403, add the following.
Chairman, I reserve a point of order.
Congress must act now to overhaul Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act. What Congress intended as a limited protection for tech companies has turned into the equivalent of a bomb shelter. Special treatment for Silicon Valley must stop. Until Congress overhauls this law, big tech censorship of conservative voices and views will continue to plague the American people, undermine First Amendment values, and threaten individual liberties that are at the core of our democracy.
Yeah.
The gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes in support of your amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And the clerk has just read the amendment in its entirety, and I appreciate that. I want to give you, we're talking here about attacks specifically upon conservative voices and views. So here's an example. A big city newspaper, and this is real, this is real, writes an inflammatory opinion piece versus a public figure. It's so inflammatory that they lost its motion to dismiss on the defamation suit because it was malicious. Then USA Today picks up that piece from the New York Times. They quote the New York Times piece, including the erroneous language. Then what happens on social media with these big tech giants? Facebook and social media relies on that USA Today piece, apparently in its algorithm, and apparently that's what they're relying on, and they turn off the victim, a conservative voice, they turn off their Facebook site. Tens of millions of followers can't find that information anymore. And that is the victimization and the censorship by high-tech, big tech giants of conservative views and voices. Let me give you another example. A Canadian news and news and commentary provider on the internet. They're suspended by YouTube for 1 week. You take them down, that means, of course, they lose followers, they lose the monetization of that. Why did they get taken down? Because they had a 3-month-old video about how social media companies had been censoring President Trump. The video is 3 months old. That same video, by the way, is on dozens of YouTube news sites, including CNN's, ABC's, and Wall Street Journal. But the only place it was censored was the Canadian news and commentary place, because that is a conservative voice. So my amendment really wants to include the language to explain why Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act needs to be overhauled. I've given you 2 brief examples, and believe me, we could give you a whole litany of examples. I want to look at my Republican colleagues, and I wonder how many of you have been have been censored, had your social media sites taken down. I have. Then we could get a little note saying that we took it down in error. This needs to be fixed. And in some ways, it simply needs to be enforced. Anyway, the point is, something needs to be done with it. That's what this amendment's about. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I'm going to yield to the gentleman from Ohio.
Well, I thank gentleman for yielding. I support the amendment.
The gentleman from Ohio is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This is, such distinguished scholars as Alan Dershowitz say, this is what has to happen to allow free speech, the First Amendment, to flourish as we want it to in this great country. So this is a simple concept. This is a report, right? This is not legislation. This is a report saying this is something we should do to stop the censorship, largely, we believe, of conservatives, but we want all speech out there. As I think what Justice Brandeis says, the answer to, quote, disinformation is more speech, more information. That's what we want. This is something this committee, the committee that's supposed to protect the First Amendment, could go on record on in this report and say, we support this change that will allow greater speech, more speech, allow the First Amendment to flourish like it's supposed to in our great country. With that, I yield back to the gentleman. Thank him for sponsoring this language to add to the report.
I thank the gentleman, and I will yield back to you, Mr. Chairman.
The gentleman yields back. I now recognize myself in opposition to the amendment. If my Republican colleagues disagree with anything in the report, or if they have additional matters they wish to raise, they may properly register their disagreement by filing supplemental, additional, or dissenting views. This amendment makes changes to the recommendations of the report. The recommendations consist of a menu of options for Congress to consider to promote competition online and strengthen the antitrust laws. The recommendations respond to the findings and conclusions we reached as a result of our 16-month bipartisan investigation into competition into the digital marketplace and the sufficiency of our antitrust laws. The content moderation practices of digital platform monopolies and social media companies was not a focus of the investigation. Our request for information from the investigated companies and other market participants did not seek documents or information regarding content moderation practices. Our request for feedback from leading antitrust scholars and practitioners did not ask for recommendations on reforms to Section 230 of the Communications Act. The evidence gathered during the course of the investigation does not support any findings or recommendations regarding changes to Section 230 of the Communications Act, so I urge my colleagues to defeat the amendment. I would just note in passing, to the extent that folks on the other side of the aisle get themselves all into a lather about the conservative bias of internet platforms, I would note that what has routinely been the case, and I just got it for yesterday, the top 10 performing link posts, which is measured by total interactions, are routinely the top 7 or 8 are some of the most conservative platforms. And so for just yesterday, it was Franklin Graham, Barack Obama, TMZ, Ben Shapiro, Sean Hannity, Don Bongino, Entertainment Tonight, Ben Shapiro, and Ben Shapiro. I would also, and I'd ask that that be made a part of the record without objection. And secondly, the top web publishers, again, with the highest amount of engagement are Daily Wire, Fox News, and Daily Mail by a huge margin. I'd ask that also be included in the record. So my point is, if your claim is there's conservative bias, they're doing a really lousy job. So anyway, it's not a part of the report. I have the, excuse me.
Would you yield
I
to
have
the
the time. No.
Okay.
So this is not an issue which was a subject of this investigation. It's not an appropriate amendment. I urge my colleagues to defeat it. I'm happy to take your question.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I didn't mean to interrupt. I just wanted
I
to
understand.
make sure we didn't run out of time. So my question is, if you had a platform, for instance, I don't know, one called Parler to compete with Twitter, and the big platforms that they were relying on, and you have 400,000 followers, and the big platform says, you know what, we're going to unplug Parler. What does that do for conservative voices and such as members of this body? It penalizes them.
Yeah, reclaiming my time. Look, I think, again, the question about what platforms exist and don't exist was not the subject of this investigation. This was an investigation which focused on the 4 largest technology platforms to look at the absence of competition in the digital marketplace. It was an investigation that proceeded over 16 months. It was a top to bottom review of competition in the digital marketplace. Our investigation included the collection and review of nearly 1.3 million documents from the investigated companies, third parties, and antitrust enforcement agencies. We held 7 hearings with 38 witnesses to review the effects of market power online. We heard from the chief executives of Amazon, Apple, Facebook, and Google. We interviewed more than 240 market participants, technology experts, and current and former employees at the investigated firms. We received input from dozens of leading antitrust scholars, practitioners, economists, and enforcers. And we received briefings from the Department of Justice and the Federal Trade Commission, as well as from the investigated companies, industry leaders, civil society, and trade groups. This was a serious, bipartisan investigation that produced a significant report. And again, this notion of the curating of content was not a subject of the investigation. So with all due respect to the sponsor of the amendment, I urge my colleagues to defeat this amendment. And
Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Jordan is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. You just mentioned 4 companies, Amazon, Apple, Facebook, and Google. You finished your report, wrote your report on October 6th. 3 big events happened after October 6th, after you did the report. One is one that the gentleman mentioned, the deplatforming of Parler. That happened. All four of those entities colluded to get rid of Parler. Second big event, all 4 of those entities colluded to say we are going to make sure that we deplatform the sitting president of the United States. Unprecedented. And then third, all those big tech companies said we're going to do everything we can to shield the American people, keep the American people from getting access to a pretty darn important story in the run-up to the most important election we have, the presidential election. They said, we're not going to let our platforms share the story about Hunter Biden, even though there was an eyewitness who had documents and he was under investigation by the FBI. Those are 3 pretty darn big events, and all 4 of those companies that you had your 16-month investigation on were a part of those 3 things. And this gentleman and our colleague has offered an amendment and say, look, if they're going to do this kind of stuff and they're going to censor conservatives and do whatever, at least there should be some liability protection. The liability protection they have shouldn't be there. Pretty simple approach. So you can do it. You had that great investigation that you said you did all this work, 16 months. You wrote the report on October 6th. Those 3 events happened after your report was published. That's why we're offering this amendment. And while I have another amendment coming after we accept Mr. Biggs' amendment. With that, I yield back.
The gentleman yields back.
Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Swalwell seeks recognition.
Thank you.
Mr. Swalwell is recognized for 5 minutes.
I move to strike the last word.
The gentleman is recognized.
Mr. Chairman, there's a great movie, The Princess Bride, and there's a character who misuses the word inconceivable over and over. And at one point, another.
We lost.
Character says, Biggs and Mr. Jordan continuously talk about Section 230 as it relates to what they call cancel culture. I don't think that term or that law means what they think it means. It's really rich that the same people who want to block.
Oh, no.
Block any as it relates to regulations on labor are the same people that now want to stop private sector companies like Twitter, like Amazon, like Google, like Facebook from making their own private sector decisions. So guys, I don't think that word means what you think that it means. And so it's also really, really rich that these same individuals wanted to cancel Colin Kaepernick the second that he spoke out and wanted to boycott Nike, and just recently, the second that Delta Airlines or Coca-Cola spoke out about voting rights in Georgia, they wanted to cancel them. So really step back and think, are your private marketplace philosophies consistent? Because what's good for the goose has to be good for the gander. And I yield back.
Would the gentleman yield?
I would yield. I'd yield to my colleague from Santa Clara County, Zoe Lofgren.
Thank you very much. I just wanted to say I support publishing this report, even though we need to understand that this is a staff report and does not necessarily reflect the opinions or conclusions of every member of the committee. I think it was a very strong and sincere effort of fact-finding, and I think it ought to be published. But I will have some comments later regarding issues. I'll just say this, Section 230 is a very complicated matter. It really protects free speech, and the colleagues that are trying to eliminate it really are asking for something that they don't want, I think. I'll finally just stop with this. If we want to get control of intrusive power by platforms, we need to look at the collection of information and privacy. My colleague in Silicon Valley, Anna Eshoo, and I have introduced a bill that actually prohibits the collection of information. And without that collection, none of these concerns about abuses would even be possible. So I want to recommend that bill to all of those who are looking at antitrust as a remedy 15 or 10 years from now, when the litigation is concluded, the technology will have moved on. But the Privacy Act is really the answer to much of the concerns that everyone has expressed. And with that, I thank the gentleman for yielding to me for these comments, and I yield back.
Mr. Chairman.
The gentleman yields back.
Thank you.
Hold on, I just want to make
My
sure.
associate, I too will be submitting our own concerns, and I do believe that data and privacy are areas that we should especially be looking into, and I would yield back.
Gentleman yields back. The gentleman from Texas, Mr. Roy, is recognized for 5 minutes.
I thank the chair. You know, I noticed that Mr. Swalwell quoted a movie, The Princess Bride, obviously a favorite of one of my old bosses, Senator Cruz. I'd quote Austin Powers when he said to his son, Scott, you're just not getting it, are you, Scott? Because that's what's going on here, right? I mean, you can understand why Section 230 was put in place to try to make the internet work, but understand that the pieces of 230 are being used and abused today in ways that are pretty nakedly obvious, right? Going back to Senator Cruz, my old boss, he had a pretty good exchange with Jack Dorsey in November at a hearing in the Senate, in which Dorsey basically admitted, oh, sorry, we screwed up by pulling down the New York Post story and by limiting access to the New York Post story about Hunter Biden. Well, that's a pretty big mess up, right? I mean, we're not just kind of going, oh man, they're throttling our views or something. It's something personal about Chip Roy's Twitter account. This is a massive, clearly coordinated effort in October leading up to an election to kill a story that has a very legitimate interest for the American people to understand the truth. And by the way, involving China, and how much content is throttled because of China, right? I mean, there's story after story about that out there. My good friend, Senator Mike Lee, in that same hearing, he went after big tech companies for the various things that they've done and bias, going after conservatives and pointing out, by the way, that Twitter claimed it mistakenly suspended our friend Mark Morgan, the head of Border Patrol, because he's talking about issues that don't fit the company mold. And that happens all the time. Suspending accounts for people for putting out information, or if they're backing up the Chinese Communist Party, you dare not do that. One company put out a documentary, America, America, God Shed His Grace on Thee. That gets cut down. A Google spokesperson said the company's sensitive events policy designed to protect users from harmful advertiser behavior somehow got triggered. There's always an excuse every time you get one of these things. I could go down lists of dozens and hundreds of examples of this stuff. You know, let's talk about Amazon for a minute. My good friend Ryan Anderson, who wrote the book When Harry Became Sally. Ryan's a good guy. It's a good book. He's a PhD. He's talking about the implications of that social policy. Amazon pulled it down. That's you know, I guess hate content. Can't write a book that's, you know, looking at that transgender issue, certainly not through a conservative lens. Like, I mean, we want to ignore what's going on here. We can. When we're talking about this report, and let's look at what's actually going on, then we can actually see the power these companies have over the ability of the American people to understand and know the truth. Now, I'm not to suggest that it's all 100% one-sided or not, but it sure, you know, awfully walks and sounds a lot like a duck. You certainly believe it's a duck. And what we're seeing here, I'll yield to the ranking member.
I appreciate the gentleman for yielding. I would just point out the gentlelady from California earlier used the term staff report. Just remember what we're doing here. When the committee takes a vote on this, it no longer is a staff report. It's then a committee report. It's putting the stamp of the Judiciary Committee on this document, on this report. And we'd like to address the concerns that we all know are out there that have impacted, we believe, conservatives in a harsh way. And what happened last fall after this report was written, 3 unprecedented events. And as my friend from Texas just pointed out, what happened with the bearing of the Daily Post story relative to Hunter Biden in the run-up to the presidential election, truly amazing. So that we need to understand what's going on. That's why the Democrats want to pass it, because it puts the stamp of the judiciary, the House Judiciary Committee, on the report. That's what's at stake here. With that, I yield back to the gentleman.
I appreciate the ranking member. I'm running out of time, but you know, this example, the Oculus and Enduro founder Palmer Luckey reported that YouTube deleted his comments criticizing the Chinese government. Luckey tweeted, YouTube has deleted every comment I ever made about the Mumao and Internet Propaganda Division of the Chinese Communist Party. Look, guys, we're just beginning. Like, the power of corporations, our founders knew to be concerned about that. There's a great Jefferson quote about that from his waning days in the 1820s before he passed, about being wary of the size and scope of corporate America. And we should be very concerned about how much power these corporate interests have. I'll yield back.
The gentleman yields back. Any other members seek recognition?
Mr. Chairman.
The chairman of the full committee, Mr. Nadler, is recognized.
Thank you. I would just simply point out that we're talking about a committee report, actually a subcommittee report, based on an investigation that was done over a period of, I think, 16 or 17 months. If the minority has disagreements, the proper way to deal with those disagreements is to file dissenting views. If you have disagreements, you should, and I presume you will, file dissenting views. I don't know why we have to waste time with amendments to this, to the report, when the proper venue is to file dissenting views. And we will certainly permit, we must permit, and we will permit the filing of dissenting views. So I just think this discussion is superfluous, because the dissenting views should express whatever criticisms you have. I yield back.
Yield back.
Mr. Chairman.
The gentleman from California is recognized for 5 minutes. Mr. Issa.
Thank you. Perhaps the chairman's point is the salient point. This is a committee report, a staff report that is about to become a committee report, and perhaps we should forego any attempts to amend it, except I think the important question is this in fact a bipartisan study and a bipartisan report, as the chairman of the subcommittee has said? And I think it fails that test. I think you're seeing that it even fails, to a certain extent, Ms. Lofgren's test of being inclusive. So I do think that we know the outcome of the vote. We know that our amendments will likely not be included. We know we have the right to have dissenting views. But I think it's clear, and we want to make the record clear, that this is in fact a piece of staff work that is from the majority. It reflects the majority view. And to call it bipartisan, it falls short of that. It falls short of that in the past, and I certainly think it's falling short of it tonight. Yes, Mr. Cicilline, I yield to you.
Thank you. I thank the gentleman for yielding. I would first say that, as Chairman Nadler indicated, the appropriate mechanism for any dissenting views is obviously, or any disagreement, is to file additional or dissenting views. And I've already made it clear, I will support the inclusion of additional views in the report, whether I agree with those views or not, but I won't support amendments that attempt to rewrite the subcommittee report. I would say with respect to your bipartisan question, and again, throughout the investigation, we enjoyed strong support from former ranking member of the full committee, Mr. Collins, and former ranking member of the subcommittee, Mr. Sensenbrenner. After announcing the investigation, then ranking member Collins described it as normal oversight into the marketplace to say what is going on and our antitrust law is working, or is there something we need to look at? Our former colleague, Mr. Armstrong, said after our hearing with the CEOs of the 4 dominant platforms that he was proud to be a member of Congress at the end of the hearing. At our final hearing last Congress, he said, quote, through the course of this investigation, that is obvious that there is bipartisan agreement that there are serious competition concerns in the digital marketplaces. Mr. Buck, the ranking member of the subcommittee, called it, and I quote, the most bipartisan effort I've been involved in 5.5 years in Congress. Mr. Sensenbrenner, our former colleague and the former ranking member of the subcommittee, said he was proud to have worked together on this investigation, even where there was substantive disagreement, and compared it to other significant bipartisan work during his 42 years of experience in Congress as chairman of the committee.
Mr. Chairman,
he described it as, so I think
Chairman,
there was...
I appreciate that. I'd like to reclaim a little bit of my time,
Sure,
though.
I'm sorry.
I think you've made some good points. Mr. Sensenbrenner is not here, but I think there's little doubt that he would revise and extend what you've just said. Mr. Buck, would you like to revise and extend what you had said?
I would appreciate...
I would yield to the gentleman.
I appreciate the gentleman yielding. I actually think you're both right. I think what the chairman is saying is it was a bipartisan investigation, and I don't think it is a bipartisan report.
That's right.
The minority wrote a separate report. I wrote a separate report called The Third Way, and we are not, I'm not personally criticizing your report. It is your view, and it is the view of the majority. It is the majority report. But both the minority report and the Third Way report took exception with some of the conclusions, not necessarily the investigation itself, but the policy conclusions that you drew from the investigation, we took exception to. And so I think the investigation was bipartisan. I think the report was the majority report. I appreciate that.
Thank you. And I think you said very well that we can all go to the same scene of the crime and see the crime differently. And with that, I'd yield to the full committee ranking member.
Well, I think it'll be brief. I would just echo what both gentlemen have said, particularly Mr. Buck. An investigation is different than a report. And a report, as I've said now a couple times, a report that was written before 3 events that were truly, we never seen in our country before. So that's why we got concerns with, that's why we're offering amendments. And this is going to be the report, the majority report of the House Judiciary Committee. That's why we're offering amendments to it. With that, I yield back to the gentleman from California.
And with that, Mr. Chairman, I will later offer an amendment simply to clarify the point that we've been making, that this is a fine staff report being made, a committee report, but it reflects at this time only a portion of the majority or those who vote for it, and not the minority opinion. With that, I yield back.
The gentleman yields back.
Roll call.
Any additional speakers?
Chairman, move to strike the last word.
The gentleman is recognized.
I'd like to yield to Mr. Cicilline.
Oh, I thank the gentleman for yielding. Again, I think there is an opportunity, there has been an opportunity to submit additional views and dissenting views. I will say that I worked very hard to make sure this investigation was bipartisan. We worked very closely with Mr. Buck's staff, the other members of the committee on both sides of the aisle. I want to compliment all of the members of the subcommittee, both Republicans and Democrats, who took this work seriously, worked together in a bipartisan way to generate a report that I think accurately reflects the digital marketplace in the absence of competition. I think there's also broad consensus on what the solutions are. We may not have agreement on every one of them, but I am very proud of the bipartisan nature of the report and the investigation and the work that was done to generate it. I welcome Republicans who have additional views or dissenting views to file them, as is their right. That's the appropriate place to do it. And with that, there are no additional speakers. The question occurs on the amendments.
Would the chairman yield?
I hear a voice. Mr. Raskin. Sorry.
No, it's Mr. Neguse.
Mr. Neguse.
I'm sorry, Mr. Neguse. The gentleman is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Representative Correa. I'll be brief. I just wanted to echo the comments of the chairman to say that obviously I served in the last Congress as the vice chair of the Antitrust Subcommittee. I found the investigation to be thorough, robust, and bipartisan throughout the entirety of the investigation. And I would echo the remarks that the chairman had quoted from several of our colleagues, such as a former member of the committee, Representative Armstrong. I think the recommendations that are made in the thorough staff report are comprehensive, they are ambitious, and they are bold, which is exactly what the situation demands. Ultimately, I believe that the evidence makes clear that structural reform is warranted in the case of these behemoths operating in the digital marketplace. And I am very grateful for the staff's incredible work over the course of the 2 years that we undertook during the course of the investigation in getting to where we are today. I would say I appreciate the remarks of my colleague from Colorado, Ranking Member Buck, who I certainly agree with respect to a number of the recommendations that I think are contained within the report, and also I would say within some of the views that he has expressed in his own report that he issued late last year. And I'm hopeful that we can now move forward in terms of approving this report, giving the Judiciary Committee stamp on the report, and proceeding with the very robust debate that I know we will have in the coming days, weeks, and months ahead regarding the legislative recommendations that hopefully this committee can actually mark up and send to the full floor, to the floor for the House's full consideration. So with that, I would yield back to the chairman, and I would again say thank you to him for his leadership and congratulations on a job well done.
Thank you. The gentleman yields back. There are no additional speakers. The question is on the amendment. Those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Those opposed?
No.
In the opinion of the chair, nays have it. The amendment is not agreed to.
We'll ask for a
Further
roll call.
amendments?
We'll ask for a roll call.
A roll call having been requested, the clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Nadler. No. Mr. Nadler votes no. Ms. Lofgren. Ms. Jackson Lee.
No.
Ms. Lofgren votes no. Ms. Jackson Lee. Mr. Cohen. Mr. Johnson of Georgia.
No.
Mr. Johnson of Georgia, could you repeat that?
Johnson of Georgia votes no.
Mr. Johnson of Georgia votes no. Mr. Deutsch.
No.
Mr. Deutsch votes no. Ms. Bass. Mr. Jeffries.
No.
Mr. Jeffries votes no. Mr. Cicilline.
No.
Mr. Cicilline votes no. Mr. Swalwell.
No.
Mr. Swalwell votes no. Mr. Liu.
No.
Mr. Liu votes no. Mr. Raskin.
No.
Mr. Raskin votes no. Ms. Jayapal.
No.
Ms. Jayapal votes no. Ms. Demings.
No.
Ms. Demings votes no. Mr. Correa.
No.
Mr. Correa votes no. Ms. Scanlon.
No.
Ms. Scanlon votes no. Ms. Garcia.
No.
Ms. Garcia votes no. Mr. Neguse.
No.
Mr. Neguse votes no. Ms. McBath.
McBath votes no.
Ms. McBath votes no. Mr. Stanton.
Stanton votes no.
Mr. Stanton votes no. Ms. Dean.
No.
Ms. Dean votes no. Ms. Escobar.
No.
Ms. Escobar votes no. Mr. Jones.
No.
Mr. Jones votes no. Ms. Ross.
Ross votes no.
Ms. Ross votes no. Ms. Bush.
Bush votes no.
Ms. Bush votes no. Mr. Jordan. Mr. Jordan votes yes. Mr. Shabbat. Mr. Shabbat votes aye. Mr. Gomert. Mr. Issa. Mr. Issa votes aye. Mr. Buck. Mr. Buck votes aye. Mr. Gates.
Aye.
Mr. Gates votes aye. Mr. Johnson of Louisiana. Mr. Johnson of Louisiana votes aye. Mr. Biggs. Mr. Biggs votes aye. Mr. McClintock.
Aye.
Mr. McClintock votes aye. Mr. Stubbe.
Yes.
Mr. Stubbe votes yes. Mr. Tiffany. Mr. Massey. Mr. Massey votes aye. Mr. Roy. Mr. Roy votes aye. Mr. Bishop. Mr. Bishop votes aye. Ms. Fishbach.
Aye.
Ms. Fishbach votes aye. Ms. Sparts. Ms. Sparts votes yes. Mr. Fitzgerald. Mr. Fitzgerald votes aye. Mr. Benz. Mr. Benz votes yes. Mr. Owens. Mr. Owens votes yes.
Ms. Jackson-Lee?
You are not recorded, Ms. Jackson-Lee. Ms. Jackson-Lee votes no.
How am I recorded, Mrs. Bass?
Ms. Bass, you are not recorded.
I vote aye.
Ms. Bass? Are you sure?
I vote no, I'm sorry.
You vote no, that's
Sorry.
right.
It's late.
Ms. Bass votes no.
I think you're witness tampering.
Yes, perhaps I am. Mr. Cohen?
Mr. Cohen, you are not recorded.
Can I vote aye?
Mr. Cohen, I couldn't hear you. I apologize.
Vote aye.
Mr. Cohen votes no.
No.
Mr. Cohen votes aye.
Mr. Cohen, what is your vote?
What's my vote supposed to be?
I voted no.
Mr. Chairman, I think you've exceeded the question of tampering with the voter.
We can't hear you, Mr. Cohen.
I can.
No.
Now we can hear you.
Mr. Cohen votes no.
Has everyone recorded their vote who'd like to vote? The clerk will report.
Mr. Chairman, there are 17 ayes and 25 noes.
The amendment is not adopted. Are there any further amendments to the report?
Mr. Chairman,
The gentleman from Ohio is recognized.
I have an amendment at the desk.
The clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment 2, final report on investigation of competition in digital markets offered by Mr. Jordan of Ohio. On page 403, add the following.
The amendment is considered as read. The gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes to explain his amendment.
I think the chairman, look, if you don't want to do it with 230, let's try it this way. This language, and I'll just read it. In his written testimony to the Antitrust Subcommittee 4 weeks ago, one of the witnesses, Mr. Clay Travis, observed this, and I quote, "We are living in a new gilded age where tech billionaires, maybe soon to be trillionaires, have more power than any elected official in the land. Facebook's Mark Zuckerberg, Twitter's Jack Dorsey, Apple's Tim Cook, Alphabet's Sundar Pichai, and Amazon's Jeff Bezos have more power today than Andrew Carnegie, J.P. Morgan, John D. Rockefeller, and Henry Ford ever did in the earliest days of the 20th century. These modern-day tech monopolists can pick presidential election winners, control our national debates, and decide whose voice is heard and whose voice is not heard. The Supreme Court no longer decides what the law of the First Amendment is in this country. These tech executives do." Close quote. Mr. Travis is right. Whether by deplatforming a president Mr. Travis is right. Whether by deplatforming a president or shutting down parlors, shadow banning conservatives, or colluding with news media to bury the truth, big tech has time and again shown its agenda of advancing cancel culture because of that commitment. And big tech's power, these companies represent an existential threat to American liberties. Big tech must be stopped, and special treatment for Silicon Valley must end. That was the motive behind the previous amendment. The Trump administration took significant steps to rein in the power of these companies, steps the Obama-Biden administration failed to take. The power of these companies should be broken up, and we hope the Biden administration will continue the course established by the previous administration. That is the language we seek to add on page 403 of the report. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I know the hour's late. I yield back my time.
The gentleman yields back. I'll recognize myself briefly in opposition to the amendment. Again, this was testimony that was given outside the course of the investigation, but despite that, I think it's an appropriate inclusion, dissenting views, or supplemental materials that the Republicans might want to offer in their dissenting views. That's why we have that opportunity, and so it's not appropriate to amend the report with this, and I'd urge my colleagues to defeat the amendment. Any other members seek recognition? If not, the question is on the amendment.
Mr. Chairman.
Yes.
Briefly, if I can strike the last
Mr. Iser is recognized for 5 minutes.
Mr. Chairman, I just want to ask you a question. If none of these small changes are appropriate, then why do we have the process for amending these reports? Why have it if, in fact, nothing that we would think or say is appropriate and should be put into dissenting? Why do they bother to have those rules? Can you find some reason that you're holding a markup if, in fact, nothing is appropriate to amend?
Well, the rules require that you consider amendments,
So you're required to consider amendments.
but not required to accept them, particularly when they are appropriately contained in dissenting views. That's the purpose of having dissenting views.
So if you found something you agreed with that you already wish you had put in, then in fact, it would be appropriate.
Well, I don't know, maybe, did you accept amendments from Democrats in the Benghazi report?
Actually, yes, we did.
No, you did not.
In fairness, the Benghazi Commission was not mine.
Okay.
But in fairness, we did a bipartisan investigation, as you know.
I'll ask you, as chairman of the Oversight Committee, did you accept amendments to any of your investigative reports?
Yeah, we did.
Can you give me an example?
Yeah. To be honest, I'm not sitting here.
I'm anxious to see that. But again, if there were not a mechanism for the presentation of dissenting views, then it may make sense. But this is outside the scope of the report. This is evidence which was collected after the report was concluded, and it's appropriate for dissenting views. It's not appropriate to amend the report.
I yield to the ranking member.
Then you spent several
The
minutes
gentleman yield. Would the gentleman yield?
I think he's yielding.
Mr. Issa controls the time. I think he's yielded to.
I yielded to the ranking member.
Yield to me.
Yeah, I'll yield back. I'll yield back. We've talked enough.
I will yield to the gentlelady in a second, but bipartisan reports came out of many committees, including the Oversight Committee. And it is common to have bipartisan reports. Now, the chairman of the subcommittee here, I'm not disagreeing that you have the right to have a partisan report that does not reflect our views, and you can say, as you're saying, just go ahead and submit your alternative view of all this. I'm just concerned that we're having a markup, and you're saying they're not appropriate. Well, I've got to tell you, you're right. They're not appropriate in a partisan-only report. They are appropriate in a bipartisan report, which this isn't. And I will tell you that Mr. Towns and even Mr. Cummings and I found ways to do bipartisan reports and did them often. It also meant that we didn't have markups that went like this because, quite frankly, the chairman and the ranking member said, hey, we've agreed to this thing, and there it went. Now, who sought time?
I did, Mr. Issa.
I yield. Zoe, I'd yield to you, of course.
You know, I just wanted to make this comment. I've been a member of the committee for 26 years, and this is the first time I can recall that we've had a committee markup about a report. Ordinarily, the committee majority files a report and disagreements are filed both by the majority members and the minority members. I've filed disagreements with reports filed by the majority in the past. I think really this whole exercise is a complete waste of time, if I may say so. We should publish the report. I have disagreements with it. I'm going to file those disagreements. The minority has disagreements. They will file them. It's just a report, and I really do think this is really a futile exercise and a waste of our time.
And we'll try to make it as brief.
And with that, I yield back.
Thank you. I'd further yield to the ranking member.
Well, but you can't have it both ways. You can't talk about bipartisanship working together and then bring a bill in front of us earlier that has a commission of 15 people and they're all Democrats. You can't talk about bipartisan working together and then tomorrow tell us you're going to pack the court and put 4 more people in the court. So you have a 7-6 majority on the court and say, oh, we're working with you guys. And then you can't say we're going to have a report, we're going to put the stamp of approval of the House Judiciary Committee on it, but we're not even going to even consider your amendments to the report. So pick one, but don't act like it's both. Don't act like you're working with this and then do all that kind of stuff. I mean, the lady who just said this is ridiculous is the one who put together a report on all of us, looked at all our social media, and then posted it. But, oh, they're working with us. They want us to help them all the way. You can't have it both ways. So let's just be honest with it. If you don't want our amendments, just tell us. That's fine, but then don't give us this song and dance about how you're the most bipartisan people on the planet, because it's just not true.
The time of the gentleman has expired. I would just say in response to Ms. Lofgren's question, this is the practice that is consistent with the last major antitrust investigation that was done in the 1950s where this markup occurred. So are there any additional speakers? If not, the question occurs on the amendment. Those in favor say aye. Those opposed? No.
No.
In the opinion of the chair, the noes have it. The amendment is not agreed to.
Ask for a roll call.
The gentleman has asked for a roll call. The clerk will please call the roll.
Mr. Nadler. No. Mr. Nadler votes no. Ms. Lofgren.
No.
Ms. Lofgren votes no. Ms. Jackson-Lee. Mr. Cohen.
No.
Mr. Cohen votes no. Mr. Johnson of Georgia.
No.
Mr. Johnson of Georgia votes no. Mr. Deutsch.
No.
Mr. Deutsch votes no. Ms. Bass.
No.
Ms. Bass votes no. Mr. Jeffries.
No.
Mr. Jeffries votes no. Mr. Cicilline.
No.
Mr. Cicilline votes no. Mr. Swalwell.
No.
Mr. Swalwell votes no. Mr. Liu. Mr. Liu, I think you're muted.
No.
Mr. Liu votes no. Mr. Raskin.
No.
Mr. Raskin votes no. Ms. Jayapal.
No.
Ms. Jayapal votes no. Ms. Demings. Ms. Demings. Mr. Correa.
No.
Mr. Correa votes no. Ms. Scanlon.
Okay. No.
Ms. Scanlon votes no. Ms. Garcia.
No.
Ms. Garcia votes no. Mr. Neguse.
No.
Mr. Neguse votes no. Ms. McBath.
McBath votes no.
Ms. McBath votes no. Mr. Stanton.
Stanton votes no.
Mr. Stanton votes no. Ms. Dean.
No.
Ms. Dean votes no. Ms. Escobar.
No.
Ms. Escobar votes no. Mr. Jones.
No.
Mr. Jones votes no. Ms. Ross.
Ross votes no.
Ms. Ross votes no. Ms. Bush.
Bush votes no.
Ms. Bush votes no. Mr. Jordan.
Yes.
Mr. Jordan votes yes. Mr. Shabbat. Mr. Shabbat votes aye. Mr. Gomert. Mr. Issa.
Aye.
Mr. Issa votes aye. Mr. Buck. Mr. Buck votes aye. Mr. Gates.
Aye.
Mr. Gates votes aye. Mr. Johnson of Louisiana. Mr. Johnson of Louisiana votes aye. Mr. Biggs. Mr. Biggs votes aye. Mr. McClintock.
Aye.
Mr. McClintock votes aye. Mr. Stubbe.
Yes.
Mr. Stubbe votes yes. Mr. Tiffany. Mr. Massey. Mr. Roy. Mr. Roy votes aye. Mr. Bishop. Mr. Bishop votes aye. Ms. Fishbach.
Aye.
Ms. Fishbach votes aye. Ms. Spartz. Ms. Spartz votes yes. Mr. Fitzgerald. Mr. Fitzgerald votes aye. Mr. Benz. Mr. Benz votes yes. Mr. Owens. Mr. Owens votes yes.
I believe Ms. Demings is now unfrozen.
Ms. Demings, you,
Mr. Chairman, how am I recorded?
Ms. Demings, you are not recorded.
No.
Ms. Demings votes no.
Anyone else? Has everyone voted who wishes to vote? Oh, Ms. Jackson-Lee.
Ms. Jackson-Lee, you are not recorded. Ms. Jackson-Lee votes no.
Have all members who wish to vote voted? The clerk will please report.
Mr. Chairman, there are 16 ayes and 25 noes.
The amendment is not agreed to. Are there further amendments?
Mr. Chairman, I have an
Buck seeks
amendment at the
recognition.
desk.
Mr. Buck seeks recognition.
I have a parliamentary inquiry, if I may. Would it be
your inquiry.
permissible to allow Mr. Cohen to turn off his camera so we wouldn't have to look at him in his underwear?
Unfortunately, the rules do not permit that. Mr. Issa.
Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment at the desk, and I trust this will be the last.
The clerk will please report the amendment.
Amendment 2, final report on investigation of competition in digital markets offered by Mr. Issa of California. On page 9, immediately above header B, executive summary, insert the following. In weighing this forward and what follows, the American people should note that this document was prepared, drafted, and revised entirely by Democrats.
Is this more than 5 minutes? The gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes to explain his amendment.
As you can imagine, this is self-explanatory. As we've said repeatedly, we find nothing wrong with the majority having an opinion. Unlike the bipartisan report on Medicaid abuse by the state of New York that the late Elijah Cummings and I co-authored and submitted as a bipartisan committee report, this is in fact the opinion of the majority, or at least those controlling the majority staff. I have no problem with that. I just simply believe that somebody looking at a committee report should recognize without a dissenting report that in fact this reflects your view as a result of your hard work over 16 months. And I believe this succinctly does so, and would trust that it would be included so that we could all move on happily. And with that, I yield back.
The gentleman yields back, and I'm going to recognize myself in opposition to the amendment. My opposition is that this amendment actually doesn't reflect accurately both the process and the contents of this report. This report was the result, and I'm going to go through this in some detail because Mr. Issa, for example, was not on the committee in the last Congress, so he may not be familiar with some of this history. But this report was the result of a bipartisan top-to-bottom review of the digital economy. We worked closely with the minority from the outset, and their input and contributions are reflected throughout the report. I want to take a few moments to review the facts. When we launched the investigation in June 2019, then Ranking Member Doug Collins described it as a bipartisan look at competition in the digital marketplace, and thanked Chairman Nadler and myself for our partnership. In September 2019, the staff of both the majority and minority collaborated closely on drafting the bipartisan request for information that Chairman Nadler, myself, Ranking Member Collins, and Ranking Member Sensenbrenner issued to nearly 100 market participants. This close collaboration extended to our painstaking work on the lengthy request to the investigated companies. The documents and information we received in response to those bipartisan requests provided the evidentiary basis for much of the report. From October 2019 through the end of the investigation, the subcommittee staff, both majority and minority, had bipartisan weekly calls or check-ins by email with each of the companies to discuss the committee's request for information and the status of the company's responses. Prior to the calls, majority staff circulated detailed agendas for discussion to minority staff, responded to any concerns, and often incorporated their input if any was given. Those calls and communications continued to occur on a bipartisan basis with Mr. Jordan's staff when he became the ranking member. The hearing memos for almost all of the hearings held as part of the investigation were joint bipartisan memos. The dates of these memos span from June 2019 to January 2020 and included substantial contributions and edits from the subcommittee minority staff. Importantly, substantial portions of the subcommittee's bipartisan hearing memos were incorporated into the text of the report. Majority and minority staff for the subcommittee also worked together closely to assemble a bipartisan list of leading antitrust scholars and practitioners with relevant knowledge and experience from which to solicit feedback. In March 2020, we drafted and sent bipartisan requests to this group of experts, which consisted of an even number of individuals or groups identified by the majority and the minority. Responses to those requests are referenced throughout the report. In early 2020, majority and minority staff of the subcommittee worked together on an initial outline for the report. The outline, which served as the framework for the final report, reflected significant contributions and edits from the minority. On Friday, March 13th, the very first day that Mr. Jordan became ranking member, my staff provided his team with an extensive briefing on the status of the investigation. This briefing included sharing copies of the report outlined with minority staff and a good faith commitment to work together on a bipartisan basis. We ensured that the ranking member's team was able to quickly access and review the evidence the committee had collected in response to the bipartisan request for information. We also ensured that the ranking member staff had every opportunity to actively participate in communications with the investigated companies. We continue to share detailed draft agendas ahead of joint calls. Not once did the current ranking member staff identify any concerns about gaps in the company's productions or communicate a desire to request any additional information from the companies. At every turn, the ranking member staff were given the opportunity to be active partners in the investigation, but they declined. In sum, the ranking members team had a detailed description of the committee's process, evidence, and an outline of the report more than 6 months before its publication. The ranking member and his staff never raised any concerns about the content of the report or suggested edits. Other than the ranking member's attempt to invite Twitter CEO Jack Dorsey to testify at the hearing with the CEOs of Amazon, Apple, Facebook, and Google fairly late into the investigation, he never requested the subcommittee gather evidence on issues outside the scope of the bipartisan request for information that the committee issued in September 2019. Time and again, for a period of over 6 months, we went out of our way to ensure that the ranking member and his staff had every opportunity to contribute to the investigation and to the report, and time and again, the ranking member and his staff declined our offer. After the ranking member staff declined to work together on the report, our staff made a final offer in September 2020 to the ranking member staff about whether they would like to include any additional views. Again, they declined. Once the report was drafted, the ranking member had an opportunity to read it in camera and raise any issues or concerns prior to its publication. He declined. Rather than accepting our offer to work with him to address any concerns with the report, the ranking member chose to publish a minority report, which is his right. Since the report's publication more than 6 months ago, the ranking member and his staff have not shared any substantive feedback on the report. They have not suggested any line edits or any other changes. Nevertheless, to the extent that the ranking member or other minority members have additional views they wish to share, they will have the opportunity to have them included in the printed version of the report, provided we receive them in a timely manner. For example, if the ranking member would like to offer last fall's minority report as a separate view, we would not oppose including that in the printed version of the report. We have gone above and beyond to include the Republicans at every step of this investigation. And, you know, despite the best efforts of some of my colleagues on the other side of the aisle to rewrite history on this, this has been very bipartisan all throughout. Much of the contributions of my Republican colleagues on the subcommittee are incorporated in this report. So this amendment is just inaccurate, and I urge my colleagues to vote no.
Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Jordan seeks recognition. The gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
First of all, there were several letters we asked you to sign with us that you didn't sign, and we asked Twitter to come to a hearing. You didn't agree with that, and some other issues that I would take exception to in your comments. But all the gentleman's amendment says is Democrats prepared the document, drafted the document, and revised the document. We know Republicans participated in hearings. That's why you have hearings in Congress. Both parties get to participate in them. Both parties get to ask questions of the witnesses. That's how it works. All his amendment says is real simple. Three words: prepared, drafted, and revised. You guys did all that. That's all it says. And we tried to revise it ourselves here the last 30 minutes with 2 very fine amendments, and you said no to that. So that's all the amendment does. I hope you will accept this one. I yield back.
And he yields back. Anyone seek recognition? Mr. Roy from, I'm sorry. Is there a demo? No. Yes.
No, I think, Mr. Chairman, and I know it's late, and I'll try to keep it brief. The only thing I'll add is to echo what I was saying before, is that we should all be very wary of the power of corporations. Just period. That should not be a partisan issue. That we have specific concerns that we have outlined about some of the things that we've seen occur over the last year. I mean, this is going to be a two-way street over time, I assure you. When you have this much power aggregated in the hands of corporate interests, historically, that does not spell well for a republic such as ours. And so for me, that's what I'm concerned about in all of this. There was a lot of, I think, I wasn't here for it, bipartisan work going on with my friend from Colorado and with the chair to try to get to the root of some of all this. And then here we are, as we often do in Congress now, we end up in these partisan corners without agreement and unable to come together on a report. And so that's why this amendment's important, is trying to clarify that we don't subscribe to what's in this report as written. At least that's I think is the intent. And you know, I alluded earlier to that quote by Jefferson, and I'll just leave with this, then I'll sign out. Jefferson said this in 1824. I hope we shall crush in its birth the aristocracy of our moneyed corporations, which dare already to challenge our government to a trial by strength and bid defiance to the laws of our country. I yield.
Mr. Chairman?
Oh, is that the gentleman from Maryland seeking recognition?
Yes.
Yes, the gentleman is recognized for
Move
5
to-
minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just very briefly, first, I want to commend you for your extraordinary leadership, intellectually and politically, in this project. And also, I want to commend you for the great bipartisan fashion in which you've conducted the investigation from the beginning. It's really a model. And I just want to concur, I think, with my friend from Texas, Mr. Roy, who invoked one of my favorite Thomas Jefferson quotes. And Mr. Roy repeatedly warned of the power of great corporations. I hope he joins us in moving to overturn Citizens United, which was an outrageous act of judicial activism by the Supreme Court, declaring for the first time in American history that corporations are political entities that can spend the shareholders' money however they want in political campaigns, thereby converting every corporate treasury in America into a political slush fund. So I would love to work with Mr. Roy on bipartisan amendment to reverse the Supreme Court's judicial activism there, to put corporations back in their place as economic actors and not as political actors. I hope you will also join us in our legislation to compel corporations to at least disclose to their shareholders and to the public who they're giving money to. As you know, the SEC has refused to do that, and up until now, we've not been able to get any Republican support in compelling corporate disclosure of money that they are putting into politics as independent campaign expenditures. So I'm thrilled that you've evolved to this point in your position on corporations in America. I hope also you will support the right of people who work in corporations to organize into unions, which is another countervailing power against the extraordinary power in corporations that Thomas Jefferson spoke of. So I think we've got a lot of work to do going forward, and I'm glad that this majority report that you've written, Mr. Chairman, so much stands up for democracy against the runaway power of corporations. I yield back. Thank you.
Gentleman yields back. The gentleman from Colorado is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have one quick question, and that is, will we have an opportunity to strike the last word after the last amendment, or should we speak to the report at this point in time?
I think speak to it now would be.
Okay. Well, first, I want to thank Mr. Issa for this amendment, and I think the amendment, I asked the chair to reconsider this amendment, because I think this amendment gets the chair where the chair wants to go, and that is perhaps a bipartisan vote on the committee report once it's clear that the committee report was prepared, drafted, and revised by the majority. And I think it's important to recognize that this investigation was absolutely bipartisan, and that is the investigation itself. I can remember being notified by my staff that the majority staff had contacted Republicans and given us a couple of days to look at this report. We couldn't keep the report, but we can make notes on the report. And based on those notes, I then worked with my staff in drafting the third way report. And I think it's, I don't think this is inaccurate, and I think it is, as Ms. Lofgren was saying, a way to accomplish both goals. I also want to thank the leadership of the ranking member, Mr. Jordan, and particularly the statement that he read earlier. I think this is really important, and that is the power of these companies should be broken up. And I think that's really essential, that we recognize that the censorship that the right feels, that conservatives feel, would not be so if there were 5 Googles and 6 Facebooks and 8 Twitters. We recognize that we may not get treated the same way by MSNBC as by Fox News, but we don't feel the discrimination when we have many different sources that are covering a particular situation in politics, and that gives us comfort, and that gives us the ability to get our voice out, and also for the American people to see diverse views and make an informed decision. I want to thank the chairman and my friend from Rhode Island for his work in this area. I think that we will accomplish our goals. We will move forward. We will reform antitrust laws to deal with this new area of our economy, this area that has really eluded the current antitrust scheme that was created 100 years ago and doesn't really adequately cover the situation that we need covered. And I really think it's a difficult, intellectually difficult and politically difficult move that you've made. And I give you credit for the courage to take on this very difficult area. I think these platforms threaten our liberties unlike anything that we've seen in this country since our revolution. And I think that they threaten in a way that even Democrats recognize what is happening now to conservatives may very well happen someday to Democrats. I have made a pledge not to take any money from any of these platforms or their executives. I know that some of my colleagues agree with me on that issue, and I know that the Heritage Foundation has refused money. I know that 35 different conservative groups have stepped forward and refused to take money from these companies because of the very disturbing nature of the monopoly and how they use their monopoly power. And I think it is really important that we move forward in a bipartisan manner. I thank the chair, I thank this committee for, while we throw mud at each other sometimes appropriately, we are still trying to find those areas where we can agree and move forward in that agreement. Unless there's someone else who wants to speak, I will yield back.
The gentleman yields back. Anyone else seek recognition? The question is on the amendment. Those in favor say aye. Those opposed, no. No. In the opinion of the chair, the noes have it. The amendment is not agreed to.
Mr. Chairman, I'd request a recorded vote on that.
The recorded vote is requested. The clerk will please call the roll.
Mr. Nadler. Mr. Nadler votes no. Ms. Lofgren.
No.
Ms. Lofgren votes no. Ms. Jackson-Lee. Mr. Cohen.
Cohen, no, and Cohen out.
Mr. Cohen votes no. Mr. Johnson of Georgia.
No.
Mr. Johnson of Georgia votes no. Mr. Deutsch.
No.
Mr. Deutsch votes no. Ms. Bass.
No.
Ms. Bass votes no. Mr. Jeffries.
No.
Mr. Jeffries votes no. Mr. Cicilline.
No.
Mr. Cicilline votes no. Mr. Swalwell.
No.
Mr. Swalwell votes no. Mr. Liu.
No.
Mr. Liu votes no. Mr. Raskin.
No.
Mr. Raskin votes no. Ms. Jayapal.
No.
Ms. Jayapal votes no. Ms. Demings.
No.
Ms. Demings votes no. Mr. Correa. Mr. Correa votes no. Ms. Scanlon.
No.
Ms. Scanlon votes no. Ms. Garcia.
No.
Ms. Garcia votes no. Mr. Neguse.
No.
Mr. Neguse votes no. Ms. McBath.
McBath votes no.
Ms. McBath votes no. Mr. Stanton.
Stanton votes no.
Mr. Stanton votes no. Ms. Dean.
No.
Ms. Dean votes no. Ms. Escobar. Ms. Escobar, I think you're muted.
No.
Ms. Escobar
hear me?
votes. Yep. Ms. Escobar votes no. Mr. Jones.
No.
Mr. Jones votes no. Ms. Ross.
Ross votes no.
Ms. Ross votes no. Ms. Bush.
Bush votes no.
Ms. Bush votes no. Mr. Jordan. Mr. Jordan votes yes. Mr. Shabbat. Mr. Shabbat votes aye. Mr. Gomert. Mr. Issa. Mr. Issa votes yes. Mr. Buck. Mr. Buck votes aye. Mr. Gates. Mr. Johnson of Louisiana. Mr. Johnson of Louisiana votes aye. Mr. Biggs. Mr. Biggs votes aye. Mr. McClintock.
Aye.
Mr. McClintock votes aye. Mr. Stubbe.
Yes.
Mr. Stubbe votes yes. Mr. Tiffany. Mr. Massey. Mr. Massey votes yes. Mr. Roy. Mr. Roy votes aye. Mr. Bishop. Mr. Bishop votes aye. Ms. Fishbach.
Aye.
Ms. Fishbach votes aye. Ms. Spartz. Ms. Spartz votes yes. Mr. Fitzgerald. Mr. Fitzgerald votes aye. Mr. Bentz. Mr. Bentz votes yes. Mr. Owens. Mr. Owens votes yes.
Mr. Chairman, how am I recorded?
Ms. Jackson-Lee?
Ms. Jackson-Lee, you are not recorded.
No.
Ms. Jackson Lee votes no.
Has everyone voted?
Chairman, how much?
Mr. Gates, you are not recorded.
I'd like to vote aye.
Mr. Gates votes aye.
Has everyone voted who wishes to vote? The clerk will report.
Mr. Chairman, there are 17 ayes and 25 noes.
The motion, the amendment is not adopted. The gentleman from Colorado is recognized for unanimous consent request.
Mr. Chairman, I ask unanimous consent to include the third way report in the record of this hearing.
Without objection. And the chair will also ask that the two documents, a letter from George Slover and Sumit Sharma of Consumer Reports, as well as a letter from a coalition of more than 30 groups supporting the findings of the report, be made part of the record. Without objection. A reporting quorum being present, the question is on the motion to report the final report on investigation of competition and digital markets and file it with the House. Those in favor say aye. Aye. Those opposed, no. Aye. The ayes have it, and the document is ordered reported to the House. Turn it over to Mr. Nadler to adjourn us? No? Okay. Sorry. This concludes business for, I'm sorry. Given the, I'm sorry. Oh, you're requesting a roll call. Okay, sorry. Okay. Mr. Jordan, is it yes? Okay, the clerk has asked, Mr. Jordan has asked for a roll call vote.
Mr. Nadler. Aye. Mr. Nadler votes aye. Ms. Lofgren.
Aye.
Ms. Lofgren votes aye. Ms. Jackson Lee. Ms. Jackson Lee votes aye. Mr. Cohen. Mr. Johnson of Georgia.
Aye.
Mr. Johnson of Georgia votes aye. Mr. Deutsch.
Aye.
Mr. Deutsch votes aye. Ms. Bass.
Aye.
Ms. Bass votes aye. Mr. Jeffries.
Aye.
Mr. Jeffries votes aye. Mr. Cicilline. Mr. Cicilline votes aye. Mr. Swalwell.
Aye.
Mr. Swalwell votes aye. Mr. Liu.
Aye.
Mr. Liu votes aye. Mr. Raskin.
Aye.
Mr. Raskin votes aye. Ms. Jayapal.
Aye.
Ms. Jayapal votes aye. Ms. Demings.
Aye.
Ms. Demings votes aye. Mr. Correa. Mr. Correa votes aye. Ms. Scanlon.
Aye.
Ms. Scanlon votes aye. Ms. Garcia.
Aye.
Ms. Garcia votes aye. Mr. Neguse.
Aye.
Mr. Neguse votes aye. Ms. McBath.
Macbeth votes aye.
Ms. McBath votes aye. Mr. Stanton.
Stanton votes aye.
Mr. Stanton votes aye. Ms. Dean.
Aye.
Ms. Dean votes aye. Ms. Escobar.
Aye.
Ms. Escobar votes aye. Mr. Jones.
Aye.
Mr. Jones votes aye. Ms. Ross.
Ross votes aye.
Ms. Ross votes aye. Ms. Bush.
Bush votes aye.
Ms. Bush votes aye. Mr. Jordan. Mr. Jordan votes no. Mr. Shabbat. Mr. Shabbat votes no. Mr. Gomer. Mr. Issa. Mr. Issa votes no. Mr. Buck. Mr. Buck votes no. Mr. Gates.
No.
Mr. Gates votes no. Mr. Johnson of Louisiana. Mr. Johnson of Louisiana votes no. Mr. Biggs. Mr. Biggs votes no. Mr. McClintock.
No.
Mr. McClintock votes no. Mr. Stubbe.
No.
Mr. Stubbe votes no. Mr. Tiffany. Mr. Massey. Mr. Massey votes no. Mr. Roy. Mr. Roy votes no. Mr. Bishop. Mr. Bishop votes no. Ms. Fishbach.
No.
Ms. Fishbach votes no. Ms. Sparts. Ms. Sparts votes no. Mr. Fitzgerald. Mr. Fitzgerald votes no. Mr. Bentz. Mr. Bentz votes no. Mr. Owens. Mr. Owens votes no.
Are there any members who wish to vote who haven't voted yet? The clerk will report.
Mr. Chairman, there are 24 ayes and 17 noes.
The amendment is not adopted. The ayes have it. The ayes have it, and the document is ordered reported to the House. Pursuant to the committee's direction, the chair will submit the report to the House. Members will have 2 days to submit views. Given the late hour, we hope to take up the final notice bill at a future markup. This concludes our business for today. Thanks to all our members for attending. Without objection, the markup is adjourned.